The first time you hear about this experiment, it sounds like a movie plot or a wild conspiracy. But what makes it terrifying is not the story itself. It is the silence around it. Because when something never officially happened, there are no apologies, no records, no trials, and no graves marked with names, only whispers scattered across declassified files, missing people and survivors who were told to forget what they saw. Imagine waking up one day and realizing your government tested something on real humans, then erased it from history. Not because it failed, but because it worked too well. This is the experiment. Governments swear never happened. And the deeper you go, the clearer it becomes that this is not one story. It is many stories hiding behind one lie. The lie that governments always protect their people. History says otherwise, and this story begins the same way. Many dark chapters begin with fear. Fear of enemies, fear of falling behind, fear of losing control. When fear takes over, ethics becomes optional. And human beings become tools. After the Second World War, the world entered a new era, not of peace, but of quiet panic. Nations were racing not just for weapons, but for dominance. Over the human mind, body, and behavior, leaders believed the next war would not be won with bombs alone, but with control of soldiers, civilians, and entire populations. This belief opened the door to experiments that crossed every moral line. Scientists, generals, and politicians worked together behind closed doors, asking one dangerous question. How far can we push a human before they break? And what happens if we learn how to rebuild them into something else in the United States? One of the most infamous examples later partially exposed was a program known as MKUltra. But what most people know is only the surface. Officially, it was about mind control and interrogation techniques. Unofficially, it became a playground for unethical science. People were dosed with powerful drugs without consent, especially LSD prisoners, mental. Patients, soldiers, and ordinary citizens were used as test subjects. Some were told they were part of a study. Others were told nothing at all. Some were locked in rooms for days, with blaring noise, flashing lights, and repeated messages designed to shatter their sense of self. The goal was to see if the mind could be wiped clean and rewritten. But here is the part. Governments prefer you never focus on many files were destroyed before investigations began, and many experiments were never documented at all, meaning what we know is only what survived. The Shredder's survivors later described hallucinations that lasted years, memory loss, paranoia, and emotional collapse. Some never recovered, some died, some vanished. And when families asked questions, they were told there were no records because officially nothing happened across the ocean. Similar experiments were unfolding in other countries. In Canada, patients seeking help for depression and anxiety walked into hospitals and were unknowingly subjected to something called psychic driving. Doctors used extreme electroshock far beyond accepted limits, combined with drug-induced comas and repeated audio messages played thousands of times. The idea was to erase mental illness. But what actually happened was far worse. Patients lost years of memory, forgot their families, forgot how to read and write, and, in some cases, were left like children in adult bodies. The program was funded quietly with foreign money, and when exposed decades later, governments admitted only partial responsibility. Compensation was given to some victims, but many were excluded because their records were missing, destroyed, or classified again. The same pattern: denial, delay, destruction, then silence. But mind control was not the only area. Governments explored. There were experiments on biological weapons radiation and chemical exposure, During the Cold War, soldiers were sent into nuclear test zones without full protection, told they were helping science and national security. Some were ordered to stand near detonations to study blast effects. Others marched through radioactive fallout clouds without understanding what radiation even was. Years later, many developed cancer, infertility, and genetic damage. Their children were born with defects when they sought answers. They were told the exposure was safe or minimal. Decades later, documents proved otherwise. But by then, most of the men were dead. In some cases, civilians were exposed without knowing. Entire communities were sprayed with bacteria to simulate biological attacks. Governments claimed it was harmless, but hospitals later recorded unexplained outbreaks and deaths. When journalists uncovered these stories, officials responded with the same phrase: no evidence of harm, no intent to injure, and no admission of wrongdoing. But how do you prove harm when the data was collected by the same people denying it in other parts of the world? Authoritarian regimes took experimentation even further. Political prisoners were used to test drugs, poisons, and psychological torture techniques. Prisoners were injected with unknown substances, starved, deprived of sleep, exposed to extreme temperatures, and forced to perform tasks until collapse. The goal was not science for healing, but science for control. How to break resistance, how to extract confessions, how to eliminate enemies quietly. Many of these experiments were never written down. They lived only in the memories of survivors who were later silenced, imprisoned again, or executed when regimes changed. New governments claimed ignorance, blaming the past while refusing to open archives. The truth remained buried under the excuse of national security. And then there are the experiments that targeted society itself, not individuals, but entire populations. Governments have tested propaganda, manipulation, and social engineering techniques without public knowledge, studying how fear spreads, how people obey authority, and how easily truth can be replaced by repetition. Experiments involved fake news planted in newspapers, staged events, false threats, and controlled leaks to see how people react, how quickly panic rises, how opinions shift, and how obedience can be triggered by uniforms, titles, and symbols. Some of the most famous psychological studies exposed later, like obedience experiments and prison simulations, were only a glimpse of a much larger hidden field where governments learned how to manage crowds, control narratives, and steer behavior during crises. The results of these experiments did not stay in labs. They became tools used during wars, elections, and emergencies, and the public never consented, because consent would defeat the purpose. Here is where the story becomes even darker. Some experiments were not just about learning, but about testing limits without accountability. When mistakes happened, when people died or went insane, there were no trials, only reclassification documents stamped top secret and careers protected by silence. Whistleblowers who tried to speak out faced threats, job loss, imprisonment, or character assassination. Some died under mysterious circumstances labeled accidents or suicides, and every time the same response followed: conspiracy theory, unreliable witness, no proof, and the cycle continued. The scariest part is not what we know, but what we will never know, because secrecy is not just about hiding facts. It is about controlling memory, when records are destroyed and witnesses discredited. History itself is altered. Future generations grow up believing such things could never happen, because they never officially did. But history is full of patterns, and patterns repeat. When lessons are buried, modern technology has made experimentation easier and harder. Easier because data collection is constant, through phones, cameras, social media, and surveillance harder because leaks spread faster and whistleblowers have new tools. Yet secrecy still survives under new names, like classified programs, national security measures, and emergency powers experiments. Today may not involve physical labs but digital ones. Algorithms, testing emotional responses, information exposure, and behavior modification at massive scale. People are still being studied often, without fully understanding how and why the difference is. Now, the lab is everywhere, and the subjects are everyone. Governments swear these experiments never happened, because admitting them would mean admitting that power was abused. Trust was broken, and human lives were treated as disposable. Admitting the truth would open doors to lawsuits, moral reckoning, and public outrage. So denial becomes policy, silence becomes strategy, and time becomes the greatest ally. Because as years pass, witnesses die, memories fade, and urgency disappears until only fragments remain, and fragments are easy to dismiss. But every once in a while, a document slips through, a survivor speaks out, or a pattern emerges, reminding us that history is not always what is written, it is also what is erased. The question is not whether such experiments happened. History has already answered that quietly. The real question is this: how many are still hidden, how many were successful, and how many are happening right now under different names with better technology and the same old excuse that it is for your safety? Because if governments can convince you something never happened, they can convince you it will never happen again. And that may be the most dangerous experiment of all, making people forget to ask questions, making them trust blindly, and making them believe that power without oversight is harmless. History does not repeat. Because people forget, history repeats, because people are taught the wrong version of it. And until every hidden experiment is exposed and every victim acknowledged, the silence itself remains the evidence, and the experiment continues, not in secret rooms or underground labs, but in plain sight, waiting for the moment no one is looking again.